welcome all of you who have joined us at this point. We appreciate your being with us on this monthly webinar. This will be the end of our first year of webinars. We started last January. And today we're pleased to have you all joining us for the webinar from Jim Barmore, a good friend with GPS Consulting, and we of course appreciate the support of Kuhn North America, who is sponsoring this webinar. And as I indicated, Jim is a longtime friend, and Jim does some work. Jim Barmore does some work with us at the Hoard's Dairyman farm, and so we're looking forward to his presentation, focusing on the big dollar herd decisions, which we know he talks about with a lot of his clients. And with that, Mike Hutjens, we'll let you say a few words of introduction.
Yeah, well, it's I too, Steve, will re-echo your thoughts, and that is that Jim is a good professional, personal friend as well. Jim Barmore, we're pleased to have you online as our 12th seminar for 2011. Jim is a native from Wisconsin, received all his degrees from the Big Red, the team going University of Wisconsin-Madison, going to the Rose Bowl. I'm a little nervous about Oregon, but we'll leave it at that, Jim. Jim, after graduation, worked with the VitaPlus Corporation, also with Monsanto Dairy Business Group, and then formed a partnership, as already Steve mentioned, in GPS Dairy Consulting, and he's a dairy consultant here in the Midwest, providing nutrition consulting, cow comfort, facilities evaluations, training, leadership, and people development. So he has a real strong following here in Midwest at this point. Jim is also a member of ARPAS and received an award from the American Dairy Science Association for the Young Animal Science Leader position. Jim has many more accolades on his list, but Jim, rather than take more time there, we'd like to welcome you to our webinar for here in December and turn the microphone over to you. Welcome, Jim Barmore.
Thank you, Mike. And thank you, Steve Kuhn, for your sponsorship. Hello, everybody. Hey, Mike, you always gave me a hard time at the conferences I would see you at. Where was my tie? Where was my tie? So I thought I'd put a tie on for today. So.
Well, that's good. That's
I got it on just for you, Dr. Hutjens. No, it's good to be with the group. And when I was asked about being involved in a little bit on the general topic, at first it was a little bit imposing in that it's obviously could be quite broad, and how do you kind of narrow it down? There's lots of big dollar herd decisions, and so the luxury is you get to pick and choose a little bit. So the spirit of the time together here today is just that. I've picked and choosed a little bit. Doesn't mean they're necessarily the biggest dollar herd decisions, but maybe rather the ones that I fairly commonly or more commonly will see opportunity around in my travels, and thought I would share some of my perspective, if you will, around some of these herd decisions. So with that, we'll get started. I think we're going to stop for just a couple quick question polls as we go, and if we could, maybe we'll try to let the questions keep to the end, and we'll try to stay on task here and allow some time at the end for questions, if that's okay with the group. I guess I'm controlling the slides, right, Dr. Hutjens?
You are.
Away we go. I thought just to have a little fun to set the stage here. Obviously a brilliant individual, must have had a good sense of humor too, but I came across this quote, and I actually thought it really had some relevancy to the talk today. And the quote reads, "Not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts." And one thinks about that a little bit in the context of our travels out to the dairies and working in the industry. I think we've come miles over the last decade or so as far as data capture, having technology in place to capture herd records and analyze it and so on and so forth. But that said, I think now maybe the crossroads we're at as an industry is getting a little more focused on what are those key metrics that really are most paramount to the bottom line of the dairy. And so anyhow, I thought this could be a bit of a spirit maker for the entire talk today. Well, the place I want to start is just a quick reminder, as we all know, that these are typically going to be our three biggest costs of producing milk. And so I want to pick and choose a few things around each of these three. And I think I want to just pose the question throughout the talk: do we know our cost to produce milk per hundredweight, or do you know your cost per hundredweight? And as straightforward as that sounds, I think what I find, at least in my travels, is when you really start to drill down into it and make sure that you have data integrity, you have knowledge with the key stakeholders around what those figures are, you go back and you do some double checking. Quite frankly, there's often gaps, and sometimes significant gaps, in really having good financial numbers. And I guess I would suggest up that even though we all tend to focus on the performance side of our day, you know, how to get more milk, more pregnancies, etc., ultimately it really does come down to, you know, what is the cost per hundredweight of milk. And sometimes producing more or higher performance really isn't going to necessarily generate the best cost per hundredweight. So with that, I want to kind of tease out a few of these in the feed replacement and labor costs. And then one other thing I want to do to just kind of set the stage is I borrowed a slide from a colleague of mine, Dr. Greg Bethard, who's in our consulting group, involved in our consulting group. And he's given a talk, some of you maybe have heard it, where he called it the top 10. Actually, there's 11 of them, but the top 10 keys to dairy profits. And I just quickly want to run through this list. You can read for yourself some of these, the second one being healthy, fresh cows. And the reason I threw this in here is I just want to make the point that there's some very big dollar decision areas that we're not going to cover. And number two is, I think, a great example of that. Transition management, fresh cows, we could have an entire talk on that. I don't want to leave the talk having anybody feel like healthy, fresh cows, or for that matter, cow comfort, or some of the other things that I'm not going to touch on aren't very key to dairy profitability, but rather, again, I'm just going to pick and choose. And so the ones in blue, if your color's coming through okay, number 3 is offer career change to unprofitable cows. I'm going to touch on that. Number 6, minimizing feed cost per hundredweight. And then to finish out his list, number 7, he talks about high quality forages. Number 8 is getting your cows and heifers pregnant. Number 9, minimizing replacement costs. I'll touch on that. Number 11, the labor costs. So again, he points out the goal is to make low-cost milk. It's not necessarily who's got the highest performance. So with that, I'll turn it back over to these guys, and we're going to take a minute and just run a poll.
Okay, we're off and running here. You Democrats, you should be voting early here at this point. Even your Republicans can vote. Jim's question, which feed metric cost is least valuable? Least valuable. Sounds like a Democratic vote to me at this stage of the game. So you've got 30 seconds. The poll is now open, and we're off and running at this stage of the game. And Jim Barmore, can you see the poll at this point as well?
I'm anxious to see how this turns out. Interesting.
I can see the poll. Can you see the poll, Jim Barmore?
Yeah, I had to make one little click, but I can run it.
Okay, very good.
Over half of you have voted now. That's great.
We're getting pretty close here. We're done? We're done. All in, all done.
Okay.
And Jim Baltz now has shared that with the people, so they can see the poll at this point. Jim Barmore, what do you think of the votes?
Well, it came out with not quite even, but certainly there was a fair number of votes, about a third on ration cost per cow per day, and there was almost half on purchase feed costs. So we'd have to go with the poll says number 3, purchase feed costs might be the least valuable. And before I flip to the next slide and give my justification for my answer, I might just say that, you know, this is the kind of thing where there could be good debate and discussion around for 20 minutes, and that's not the intent. But let me just share my rationalization for, I myself would put number 2, ration cost per cow per day. And the reason I say that, and we may want to ask Dr. Hutjens to weigh in with his view of this, is it's so biased by just dry matter intake. You know, you can have somebody that's got a very high dry matter intake and possibly doesn't have very good conversion to milk. Their feed efficiency isn't all that great. And so it really doesn't give you any of the income side of it. Now, you could say the exact same thing for number 3. Purchase feed cost doesn't give you any of the income side of it, but it does tell you something about cash flow that may be required within that dairy. In other words, if purchase feed costs were extremely high relative to another operation, it might raise some discussion and alert you to, just some potential cash flow, short-term cash flow type needs. So my intent was maybe to be just a bit debatable or controversial, and that I'm not sure there's a right answer. But I myself would certainly spend more time focusing on the income related to feed cost, and I think number 4 is ultimately what we're after, our feed cost per hundredweight of milk. And then the last thing I was just going to throw out that isn't on the slide is I actually like to use cost per pound of dry matter. I find that to be a good feed cost metric, and I was going to throw that out as well. I don't know, Dr. Hutjens, do you have any comments?
Nope, I think you've done it very, very well. I sense, though, purchase feed cost, Jim, is more interesting on the East Coast because those farmers tend to buy more than, say, those crooks here in Illinois, for example.
Yeah, there can be a huge difference, right? Yeah, I agree. Very good. We'll plug along if we can. So I want to just talk a little bit more about this feed cost, and in some cases it's been a giant figure and concern for all of us in the last couple of years. So by definition, it includes milking and dry cows, and I would suggest it should not include heifers. The heifers really should be calculated in a replacement cost, which we're going to touch on in a little bit. It needs to be calculated from financial statements. And then the bottom bullet there lists a number of factors that can impact our feed cost. Certainly the income side of it, when you express it as a ratio, you got a numerator and a denominator. So obviously the milk produced and the income associated with that milk is part of the calculation. The number of dry cows and the dry cow ration cost goes into that, and there can be some wide variation. I think one that I see commonly miss or lacking accurate data would be around the next 2, which would be the feed shrink and the weigh-backs or feed refusals, the push-outs, whatever terminology you like to use, and having proper valuation around the weigh-backs as well as an estimated shrink or an actual shrink. Those can really be some fairly significant numbers. And then last one, sometimes the way in which people are running their inventories, the timing and the methodology that they're using for their inventories can have some impact on feed cost per hundredweight. One of the things I really want to draw out, and this has been somewhat humbling for myself, that we'll get into situations where our feed cost per hundredweight on the financial statement does not always match what's going on at more of a day-to-day level at the dairy, where they're using feed tracking programs, they're using ration cost, the nutritionist has their ration cost in there, and you get to the end of the month or end of the year and you line that with actual financial statements, and sometimes there can really be some fairly large discrepancies. And particularly with high feed costs, it could be very major discrepancies in some cases, depending on how many cows. So I just want to talk about where is some of this variation coming from. So knowing your true feed cost, and I really think it does relate to both the feed variation and feeding deviations. And in my travels, when we get the financial statement showing some of these large discrepancies between what maybe the nutritionist or some of these tracking programs are coming up with, ultimately we've been able to go back and pin it down on the first bullet point where it's talking about the feed contract prices. At what point are some of these contract prices being implemented and inputted into some of these other records programs or ration programs, and there could be a time lag or maybe some incorrect prices. And likewise, the feed shrinks not being accounted for properly. Spot market variation, what I mean by that is you may have a price in the system, but next week it changes significantly, but yet 3 weeks go by, 4 weeks go by, and it maybe wasn't updated in the system. All things that, it's quite easy to have happen with everybody being busy. Another one is ration overfeeding. Just can show up in a couple ways. Maybe the ration is being fed in a way where there's overbalancing that's occurring, or more likely would be where the dry matter intake being used on the ration actually does not match up particularly well with actual intakes and what's showing up in a feed tracking program. And so if you're off by 2 or 3 pounds of dry matter intake over the course of a year, and that obviously can show up as a significant feed cost variation. Moisture adjusted costs, so often feed costs will be put in on an as-fed basis, but then the moisture dry matter changes and the dry matter gets changed in, say, a ration, but yet the cost doesn't get changed. And so again, things soon get out of whack, and at the end of the year you just have this potential for a very large discrepancy. Last one I want to throw out is really truly knowing the forage cost per ton of dry matter. And notice it says dry matter. I think that's really, as an industry, where we got to try to get. And it's really to what I was explaining just half a minute ago about the moisture adjustments. It can be done both ways, but if it's on an as-fed basis, it needs to be, I think, watched diligently and adjusted properly. And I just find there's still a lot of opportunity in the dairy industry for people to better understand what their true forage costs per ton of dry matter are. Are you guys still getting the screen okay?
Yep, we're still okay.
Right. Yeah, I had a window pop up that said maybe it wasn't showing up like it's supposed to.
Yeah,
the last point I want to make on this slide before I move on is down on the bottom below the line. It's really not a true cost. It's the potential of losing income, so an indirect cost, if you will, by having these feeding deviations and feed variation, and that could be both in a production or potential health implications. And I want to use that to segue a little bit into some more discussion about just feed variation. So in order to improve our feed cost per hundredweight, the way we would attack it is truly knowing the actual feed and forage costs. So that would be trying to keep up with the contracts, knowing your forage cost per ton of dry matter, and some of those things I already mentioned. The second point, having efficient use of labor and equipment while knowing the cost of both related to the feeding. So I'm specifically talking about the feeders, the people that are associated with any feeding, forage handling, ingredient handling, and the equipment cost. And I think for a lot of dairies, this is a difficult number to get to. It's often underestimated. And I think when we try to go back and get a real handle on this, sometimes people are surprised that there's some room for improvement on, these particular costs as it relates to feeding. Third point, process transparency and teamwork by the stakeholders, all the stakeholders involved in feeding. So maybe a wordy way of saying we have to have a teamwork that includes all the feeders, so the weekend feeders. We have to have the ability to be open in our conversations about what's truly going on. And I would offer up that this is actually a tremendous opportunity on a lot of dairies in terms of improving feed cost per hundredweight. And it could be something as simple as reducing feed shrink by the way the different feeders are working together in a week's time. So I'm going to kind of leave it at that, but I'll just offer up that I found it very rewarding and successful, if you will, working on bullet point number 3. We need to have relevant data, diagnostics, training, and coaching around the feeding. We can't just put somebody out there to run a loader and be a good operator of heavy equipment, even if they're hitting the numbers, if we're not, hitting that kind of success with all the feeders 24/7, as well as, providing the feedback to the feeders. And again, I think that's a real opportunity as far as reducing feed costs. And then the last one I want to talk a little bit about is this whole area of feeding deviations and finding and really understanding where are these gall-darn deviations in the feeding coming on a day-to-day basis, and what's the magnitude of those swings and errors, and what does that really cost us. Just real quick, a little bit of a breather here. I don't know if anybody's ever read this book, Understanding Variation, The Key to Managing Chaos by Donald Wheeler, and if you haven't, you kind of enjoy the whole concept of process variation and process control, you might enjoy this book. And there's a quote I took out of the book. It reads, "Variation is the random and miscellaneous component that undermines otherwise fairly simple processes." And I really like that, because sometimes what seems to be so simple, all of a sudden day-to-day variation can really throw you for a loop. And I think feeding's a classic example. So I like to use this slide when I'm working with a dairy. And notice it doesn't necessarily talk about a better ration. Rather, it's central to this whole concept of reducing the variation within the feed program, improving the consistency, which is another way of saying it, and then really tying that back to the concept of managing risk management in your dairy, really not just from the buying or selling of the milk, but rather minimizing the variation within your feed program, and talking about the cost or the value that goes around managing the risk. So if I could, I just want to drill into that a little bit more. So the place to start is we need to know the ingredient variation, and really what we're saying is we need to know the nutrient variation within ingredients. And one of the ways we're doing that is we've gone to more frequent testing. An example would be, a lot of people feel that you have to use wet chemistry. I guess I see it a little bit differently. I think more frequent sampling with NIR, particularly for forages and in certain types of nutrient parameters, and having a more robust database is very, very valuable. And so we spend a lot of time really trying to know what is our ingredient variation. So not just what is the nutrient analysis on a given sample, but rather how much variation might we expect around a particular ingredient. Forages obviously are paramount, cornerstone of our operations, and so trying to better understand the variation within the forages. I took this slide, borrowed it, I should say, from Dr. Tom Olberg, who's with Diamond V Mills. Many of you probably know Dr. Olberg. And it's just, I think, a great visual of showing the variation in a pile of haylage that clearly from the picture you can tell is very well packed, well managed, well faced. I don't know how much better it could be, but yet based on the 10 samples that they took from this pile that was 135 feet wide, you can see really quite a bit of variation. I would call it significant variation within crude protein from that haylage. So one of the things we've gone to, and I'm sure many people are doing this, not only do we carefully manage the top layer, remove the spoiled feed, very careful to keep our plastic and tires tight. We've got a nice vertical firm face using a defacer, but we've gone to piling and stirring, pre-stirring, pre-mixing, if you will, the forage to try to minimize some of that variation. So I want to quickly go through a list here, and there's several bullet points. So in interest of time, I really just want to focus on the first one that's in bold, and it says, minimizing silage feeding variation. Invest in a forage harvest plan for both haylage and corn silage, and I could have had other cereal silages as well, covering all the details of the harvest to minimize the variation. And the point I want to drive home here is I think too often, particularly as nutritionists, we're all a bit accepting of the fact that once it's in the bunker, once it's in the pile, it's our job to do the feed testing, do the best ration balancing we can, stay on top of the variation. But the blind spot of that type of thinking is once it's in storage, there's an inherent amount of variation that we're going to have to live with. We can do a better job of understanding it and managing it, but really it's on the front side of the process, meaning the harvesting side of it, that I think there's still a lot of opportunity. And I kind of learned that from being fortunate working with some tremendous dairies where they taught me more about that than I ever taught them, where over time I noticed that part of our success was predicated on the fact that there just was minimal forage variation throughout a pile or throughout a bunker relative to other dairies that maybe didn't have the same kind of success. And just really quite impressive how well that variation could be managed on the incoming side of it. There's other things in the bullet points here that talk about discarding spoiled silage and managing the face, things that I think people are all well aware of. But again, they all relate to minimizing your shrink and minimizing the variation day to day of what that ration is, which I think all show up as a feed cost per hundredweight type issue. I am not going to go through this list. The reason I threw this slide in here, I just want to try to make the point that I think every dairy needs to have protocols and training in place that are directed towards the feeder, towards the feed people, in terms of managing variation and having systems in place to deal with the weather, the rain, those kinds of things that can undermine good consistency in the feeding program. So with that, I'm going to leave that slide as something that can be referred back to. I do want to just share this is real life data from just real recently this fall. This is a herd, happens to be an international herd that I was asked to work with. And one of the things that they wanted to do was, of course, improve their production, but also reduce their feed cost per hundredweight. And we spent a lot of time working on their feeding management program, trying to tighten up their consistency, figure out where the variation was coming from. The red line represents 7-day average milk, and the blue line represents daily milk. And so if you look to the left of the heavy blue arrow, you'll see some pretty significant milk swings that were going on. It's liters per day, and you can see there's some significant swings. And after we really focused on several feeding management type things, not only do I think daily milk variation tighten up a little bit, but you can see clearly the herd started to see some response. And so, I just use this as a quick real-world example that my experience has been that tightening up the feeding management really not only has the impact to improve production, but at the same time, I think it's going to tighten up feed shrink and some of these other factors that go into feed cost per hundredweight, and ultimately that is going to be beneficial in terms of lowering your feed cost per hundredweight. I just want to make a couple quick comments about feed efficiency. The first couple bullet points there just refer to the definition of feed efficiency, which I think due to people like Dr. Hutjens, we're all pretty well educated on. Bullet point number 2, there's a number of variables that play into this whole feed efficiency thing. But it's the third point I want to just make a comment on. Rumen health and ration variation impact feed efficiency, or in other words, feed digestibility, NEL, if you want to refer to it as NEL, can vary with the rumen environment. And what I see very often is that we can improve feed efficiency by improving our feeding consistency, which ultimately is going to have an impact on our feed cost per hundredweight by the fact we're probably going to get more milk and or reduce our ration cost by being able to tighten up our rations. And I think we all are pretty aware of that. But if I skip to the next slide, I just want to quick go through a financial illustration that I think the magnitude of the feed efficiency improvement is often missed. I think we all realize having a better efficiency is good, but we don't always turn it into dollars and cents. So I just took 2 herd examples. These are hypothetical in the sense they're not actual herds, but I will tell you these are very representative numbers of what I've seen in my travels. Herd number 1, 94 pounds of 3.5% fat-corrected milk, 59 pounds of dry matter intake for all milking strings. You do the math, you'd have a feed efficiency of 1.59. Herd number 2, less milk, 85 pounds, same fat, 57 pounds, lower intake, but yet less milk. And so when you do the math, you come up with 1.49. Again, I think that part's all very familiar. If you put the dollars and cents to it, using 11 cents per pound of dry matter for the ration, $18 milk per hundredweight, herd number 1 would have an income over feed cost of $10.43, where herd number 2 would be $9.03. And if you express that over 1,000 cows in a year's time, that's about $500,000 difference in an income over feed cost. Point being that I truly believe feeding variation has a significant impact on feed efficiency, and I think the financial implications to the dairy of improving the feeding variation and what it can do in terms of income over feed cost, or if you will, reducing your feed cost per hundredweight, I really think is significant. All right, moving on. This is just another slide I took from Dr. Greg Beathard, and he talks about low forage quality and how it has trickle-down economics, poor cow health, poor fresh cows, et cetera, and kind of a strong view of his part, but on the bottom he says eventually you're going to be a broke dairy. And what I did was I just inserted up on the line up on top there, low forage quality. I think even variable forage quality. I'm not so sure it has to be low quality. I think sometimes we underestimate the impact of variable quality. Okay, I'm going to shift gears. I want to talk a little bit, just a couple slides about labor efficiency and controlling labor costs. So I would suggest the goal is not cows per employee or milk per employee, and certainly everybody has their own opinion and view of this, but I think this is a real mistake. We spend too much time focusing on the amount of milk or cows per employee when ultimately I think it's a lot simpler than that. It's what is our labor cost per hundredweight. This is one of those metrics where we just have to get it down to our cost to produce milk. Some people will say from a dairy only labor cost ought to be less than $1.60, but I also would say I think it's important that the goal is set for each dairy. Point being, you need to have knowledge of what that number is, and you need to have a goal. And then keep in mind that if you're going to try to benchmark that in the industry, that replacement cost, heifers that is, and feed procurement or feed harvesting, forage harvesting, normally would not be included in that or should be kept separate if you're going to benchmark, because a lot of dairies would just have the dairy cost of milking cows and running the barns. So you got to be careful. Your contract labor, your forage harvesting, that kind of thing can distort that figure. All right. I said I was going to shift gears quickly from labor. I want to talk a little bit about herd culling. This is an area that I think is really sometimes misunderstood and yet a real financial opportunity for dairies. And so I just want to try to drive home a couple points. The goals of a herd culling ought to be to not milk unprofitable cows. And I think everybody knows that. Probably where it gets lost in translation is what is the definition of an unprofitable cow, and what's the time lag in which it takes for a decision to be made on a particular cow. Cows that will generate less profit in the future relative to replacing a quality heifer. We always want to milk the most profitable cows is another way of saying that, and there's tools like CowVal and DairyComp that can help us make those decisions. Another goal is we need to implement a do not breed philosophy and protocol, with a goal being between 2 to 10%, I would suggest. Very often, everybody's job is nobody's job, as they say, when it comes to do not breed. And we continue to put semen in cows, and next thing you know, we're breeding the cow 10 times, 11, 12 times. And yet when we stop and ask the question, was this a good financial decision? You'll see a lot of head scratching going on. So having clarity around the do not breed protocol and philosophy. It goes without saying on the fourth bullet there, we want to cull potentially infectious or infectious cows. And the last one, which I'll touch on here in a few minutes, is we want to lower the replacement cost. And the replacement cost is really a function of the cow value and the heifer cost. The last point in blue, I think, is really important. Cull rates will vary from farm to farm, dairy to dairy, and may or may not be a direct reflection of collateral damage. The dairy industry has just got to get off this deal where the higher cull rate is interpreted as a poorer performing dairy. And I think we all realize that's not necessarily true yet. I still see a lot of conversations get mixed up where somebody will suggest that somebody with a 36% cull rate is doing better than somebody with a 30% cull rate. And financially, when you look at the financial statements, that might not be true at all. And so I just want to kind of walk through that a little bit. Now, even though cull rate over the whole herd might not be a good indicator of collateral damage, as I call it, I do think looking at fresh cow cull rates does very much reflect, are we breaking cows leaving that shouldn't have lost the herd, or left the herd, excuse me. So what I did here was I just threw out some of the goals that we like to use with our consulting group for sold and dead, lactation equal to 1, 3%, and that's for less than 30 days in milk, and you can kind of read along there. The the top two bullet points are for lactation equal to 1, and then it's separated by less than 30 days of milk or less than 60. I think everybody's familiar with those types of metrics, and those are the goals that we use. And also, you know, we feel strongly that that is a good direct reflection of whether we're breaking cows or collateral damage, as I referred to it. I want to go back to the financial side of this, though. How do you decide when to trade up on a cow or when a cow isn't profitable? So this would be an example. I think what we all do in the industry, we take the price or value of milk, we'll take the cost of feed. A lot of times we'll add in a little bit of cost for T-dip chemicals. Some people will put in an interest cost, and also called an antibiotic risk, meaning there's some imputed risk of having later lactation cows that are maybe more likely to be treated if they're high cell count type cows, etc. And anyhow, you come up with your total variable cost, in this case $5.70. You divide it by your milk value, and it would say, okay, you need to get 32 pounds of milk as a break even, and if she's milking more than that, she's making you money. Well, just simple partial budget type math, I think that's true, but I also think there's some real blind spots with that type of thinking, and I've listed a few here. How much do lame and sick cows cost a dairy? Just the time, people time, medicine treatment type cost, the time it takes to get lame cows up to a milking center, to a parlor. There's a cost associated with some of these cows. How much do these chronic high somatic cell count cows cost? It's not unusual to see dairies that might have 10% of the herd that are chronic high cell count cows that might arguably be good trade-up cows. What value does a younger herd bring, particularly during heat stress or in relationship to conception rate, pregnancies? I think we would all agree that having a younger herd sometimes is an easier herd to manage. So the real question becomes, you know, how much is this trade-up value worth? And if you take in today's dairy economy, we've been fortunate. Our beef prices have been fairly strong. I just used the range of $900 to $1,200. I threw in a Springer purchase price of $1,400 to $1,700. Obviously, that could go either direction of that. But if you take those kinds of numbers, I would suggest there's a lot of financial incentive to trade up on cows. And again, I want to just take it a step further. What if we had some cows in our herd where their ME milk was 4,000 pounds below the herd average? And so what I did, for sake of example, is I took that 4,000 pounds of milk. I said milk value was 18 cents a pound. That would give you a $720 milk value. I took the feed it would take to make 4,000 pounds of milk, and that's just a 2.5 to 1 conversion, so 1,600 pounds of dry matter. I used 10 cents a pound in this case for simple math, and that would come up with a difference of $560. So if you take your beef cull, and I'm talking a quality cull cow, but if you take a typical beef quality cull value, and you take the value of this 4,000 pounds of milk that may be missing on a lower producing cow, and you have the opportunity to trade up to a genetically superior animal or an animal that's capable of milking, you know, at a higher level of ME, you very quickly could argue that, again, that it's a sound financial decision in today's market, and I think a lot of people have been doing that. And then I just kind of want to reiterate, the net result of that herd upgrade is not only you're going to probably have better milk flow, but less animals in your hospital pen, possibly a lower somatic cell count, which could impact your milk premiums. Consistently, I've seen situations where the herd does better during the summer, more heat tolerant if it's a little younger herd, and fewer health problems. And again, some of you have heard Dr. Greg Beathard talk about this same concept of trading up cows and financially how it's often an opportunity that gets missed. Okay, shifting gears over to pregnancies and getting cows pregnant. Quick point, pregnancy hard count is more important than pregnancy rate. Pregnancy rate has become a very key metric the entire industry is using. It's very valuable, but I would suggest, and I think others would too, that ultimately it's not just the rate, really it's what is that hard count, and are we meeting a minimum hard count for the dairy? All right. So with that, I want to just pause, and I want to ask about pregnancy rates, but not for the milking herd, but rather for the heifer replacement animals, and what does the group feel is a reasonable and obtainable preg rate for heifer replacement. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mike and Jim.
Okay, we're off and running here again. Chance to vote, and boy, they are really voting quickly here. I can see them coming in quickly at this point, and we are moving right along here. Our polls will be closing. We're almost at 50% voting here. That's better than what's going to happen in the election next year. So, Jim, you must be an eloquent campaigner at this stage of the game, and we are almost going to be at 75% here in just a few seconds at this point. And, you know, this is the one I had to scratch my head on just a little bit as well, because it's a little different when you say heifer replacement preg rate versus herd at this stage of the game. So I think we're going to go ahead and close it right off, and we got 75% of the votes in, and there it is. So, Jim Barmore, what do you think of your constituency of our 53 voters today?
I'm impressed. I truly am. Obviously, a knowledgeable group we got on the call. So this one is really a fun one, and it's been enjoyable to talk to dairies about heifer replacements and preg rate goals and getting animals pregnant. And part of the reason I think it's so fun is all the hard work's been done the prior 10 years or thereabouts in terms of helping people understand what is a preg rate and what goes into that calculation and what can we do with synchronization programs and so on and so forth. All the hard work of getting that animal pregnant, so to speak, has really been practiced and implemented on most dairies. But yet a lot of people have kind of missed the opportunity to drill down within their replacement program and get some clarity around what should that goal be, how are we doing. Often they're breeding heifers on multiple sites, making sure they got good data integrity and reporting, and then, you know, having a consensus with their team of people that's involved. And the point I want to drive home, and again, I'm impressed with the group's answers, that greater than 38% is obtainable. And it's albeit a lofty goal, but it's very obtainable. And it has some significant financial repercussions down the road in a positive way in terms of filling that heifer pipeline and giving dairy the opportunity to trade up and put themselves in a stronger position with the profile of their herd. And just as a quick snapshot, this happens to be a dairy that I work with, and you can see in the small print there above the red arrow that they're running over 40% on their preg rate for their heifers. So anyhow, pretty clean and simple. Just want to put that out there that I think that's a real opportunity for the industry to focus a little harder on their replacement heifer program and getting heifers pregnant. Okay. Going to take this thing home. Got a few slides to talk about this replacement cost. And the first thing I want to do is give due credit, again, back to Dr. Greg Bethard. Some of you heard him present this same type of talk out at the Western Dairy Conference. He's also presented at one of the Discover Conference. And frankly, a lot of these slides Greg allowed me to use. And really, Greg is the person that gets the credit for this. But this whole concept of what does replacement cost mean, and is it really an opportunity for your dairy? So the definition of it is the cost of maintaining herd size and structure. And you really need a good, accurate P&L statement with accurate herd records to get to the bottom of what this cost is. What drives it is hundredweights of milk, because it is expressed on a per hundredweight basis, so obviously we need our milk ship. It's all about heifer cost, and it's complete heifer cost, so feed, labor, breeding, medicine, etc. But it also includes cull rate, because again, it's about maintaining herd size. So we need to know what our cull rate is, and we also need to know the value received or the payment received on the animals leaving the herd. So that obviously could go from a high of $1,200-$1,400 to virtually nothing if we have dead animals. One other point I want to make, we're not going to get into it today, is some people will calculate this replacement cost on a cash basis. Others will use it on a depreciated value, and that's really beyond the scope of the time we have today, but I just wanted to make that point. Be aware of that. All right, a couple slides we're going to run through an example, and this is kind of fun. 4 scenarios. They're all the same size herd, 1,000 cows, milking 850 cows. The milk production is a low of 60 pounds for herd C, a couple herds at 70 pounds, the high herd's 85 pounds, and then there's a difference in the cull rate. 2 of the herds are at 35%, one's at 25%, and high herds at 45%. And so as it relates to this replacement cost calculation, right away you start to get some of the dynamics that it's not just a single figure you're looking at, but rather you need to fill in some of these others, namely the death loss, the value of the animals that left the herd. Of course, depending on their cull rate, the number of culls per year is going to vary. You need to know what it cost for a heifer replacement, or if you will, just think of it as purchasing a replacement. It kind of clears up a little bit how the calculation is run, I think, if you just think of it as if you were buying the heifers. And then based on your cull rate, the number of replacements. And so these are the line items that are involved in the replacement cost. And when you go through and you start to think this when you think about this at a little deeper level, I think sometimes people are surprised. You might think, well, the high cull rate's going to have the highest replacement cost. Well, over on the right, herd D, you can see with their 45% cull that wasn't necessarily the case. They were kind of in the middle. And so it's a robust enough exercise to come up with this replacement cost. You need to sit down, gather your data, and yet very, very telltale in terms of the difference in some of these herds. This is per hundredweight of milk. So in other words, if you just took herd A and herd B, you have $1.20 roughly difference per hundredweight cost just in the replacement part of the program. As far as benchmarking some numbers, just putting this out that you can see in these states, and this comes from Genske and Mulder and some of the work they do, what the replacement costs are for the top 25%. Not going to really spend any time on this, but just giving you an idea of what the variation in different regions across different years is. And again, you can see that there's a real opportunity to drive down your cost to produce milk within your replacement program when you look at the variation of these numbers. Last slide before I turn it back over and wrap up here. I just want to make a point about production efficiency. I've been as guilty as the next person, focusing sometimes too hard on production. You know, what is our total output? And that could be yield of our crops, or it could be pounds of milk. I just think at times our industry is so production driven that I think we're at a place with our economy where we need to help one another really begin to focus more on efficiency of that production. And simple definition just being, you know, what's our output relative to our input. And I gave a few examples, you know, barn and parlor capacity, you know, keeping full, feed efficiency at a cow level, clearly a good metric on the feed side of it. How about the crops to feed efficiency? And what I mean by that is of what we harvest, how much actually gets to the cow, and you know, how much of that can we control from the field and storage side of things. Heifer efficiency, the pipeline of heifers, the quality, the time frame in which they come into the herd, the in-herd growth, the IHG. I think that's a real area of opportunity. And then there's the financial side of it. I just gave a quick example of asset turnover ratio. You know, how much milk are we truly producing relative to the assets? And so just this whole idea of staying centered around the concept of efficiency as much as we do around the production side of it. And then certainly a mistake I've made is sometimes we will just take more cows or less cows, and we'll do a very simple piece of math where we just multiply things by the number of cows. And so my statement there intentionally meant to be a little bit strong. Do not mindlessly multiply each item by the number of cows. Right when you do that, we're being a bit lacking in our thoughts on, you know, the efficiency concept. So with that, my summary slide would be here's 7 key financial opportunities that I commonly see. Work hard on the forage side of it, as we all do, but really focus in on this variation piece of it. The whole minimizing feed cost is obviously huge. Focus on the labor cost and express it as a per hundredweight basis rather than milk per number of people or that type of thing. I think we have to be very diligent and focused on trading up with on our less profitable cows and have definition around what does that protocol look like for each and every dairy. This whole area of the heifer replacements and getting heifers pregnant at a quick rate. Number 6, track and minimize replacement costs, which would involve culls as well as our heifer replacements. And lastly, work in this area of efficiency and bottom line being cost per hundredweight on all decisions. So with that, I think I'm maybe turning it back over to Dr. Hutjens or Steve Larson.
Yeah, very good. Steve, do you want to mention this next PowerPoint, our next couple of webinars that are scheduled and who the people are?
Right. Well, yeah, before we get into the questions, I want to thank you, first of all, Jim Barmore, for our great discussion here today. Very well done. Just before those who have to leave do so, we want to invite you to join us again on January 9th when Mike Hutjens will be talking about the milk's shrinking carbon footprint, and there's some new information out on that I think you will find interesting. That's going to be sponsored by Merck. Also on February 13th, our webinar will be presented by Garrett Etzel, University of Wisconsin, brought to us by Elanco, and he's done a lot of great work on preventing and treating ketosis, and we hope that you will join us for that session as well. Mike?
Jim, if you can move to our next PowerPoint, we want to make sure that we do recognize, as Steve and Jim have both pointed out, our sponsorship again today. Without these sponsors, these webinars could not happen. So we certainly want to thank them very much. And we've got some questions here for you, Jim. If you're ready to put your hat on, I know we'll start losing people here at this stage of the game because we're close. But my compliments, you stayed right on schedule. I'm impressed. You are probably one of our first speakers who really hit exactly the timeline that we were discussing. So kudos to you, Jim Barmore, in that aspect. The first one has to do with forage production costs, and there's always been a controversy, at least in our dairy meetings, when we look at a forage cost. Jim, what do you favor, putting in the cost of production on my farm, or do I put in the market price that may be occurring in the industry? And of course, the hay one comes to mind as quickly as we're hearing hay prices of $250 a ton, and yet Dave Fisher says in Illinois we can produce it for about 120. Thoughts on that?
Great question. I think it really comes down to what's the question you're trying to address. So if it's looking at alternative feeds, clearly, market price is going to be involved. If you're running, some price sensitivity type stuff, or you're using an optimizer, you got to have those market values in there. But there's times where a dairyman truly wants to know what their feed cost per hundredweight is. They want to know their actual costs, or they're working internally within their farm, their dairy, and at that stage, I think you're going to try to use true cost. The conflict becomes there's times where you're trying to do both. You're going back and forth, and we don't normally have both methods set up. And I run into the same challenges. There's times where you wish you had them running in parallel. So what I tend to do is I sit down with the dairy owners and I work through what that system's going to be, and actually it might even depend a little bit on what the feed stuff is or what the ingredient is, and we just get clarity as a group of owners and myself of what the process is going to be, and that can vary from farm to farm, and that seems to be the best I've been able to come up with, because both are important.
Jim, another question here. You had shown us the variation in that foreign herd, I guess, the person was referring to. Do you have a thumb rule of how much variation you would expect to see in bulk tanks as a guideline in terms of trying to reduce variation, do it to ration or feed ingredients? Do you have a guideline number that you like to see herds not changing or varying on a per cow basis?
Yeah, what I most commonly see is a herd will tend to kind of get stuck, if you will, at a certain level of production, kind of a glass ceiling. and let's just say, for sake of discussion, they're stuck at 80 pounds of milk, and their tank average might bounce around 2-3 pounds, so they might range 78, 81, 82, that kind of range, but it's stuck around 80 pounds. And very often been able to go in, and by tightening up that variation, you'll just reestablish what that new level of milk is, or the new glass ceiling might move up. It very easily could move up 2-3 pounds, maybe even more, of milk production. Of course, it's all dependent on how much variation existed to begin with. And the other thing I really want to go back to that was in the talk is feed efficiency. I have consistently in my travels seen feed efficiency improve half a point, possibly more. So in other words, if you were at a 1.45, you might be able to move that up to a 1.5 by strictly working on the consistency within the feeding program and the forage program.
Jim, another question that came up, you had kept your dry cows in with your milk cows, but you separate the heifers out. Do you see any value of maybe taking the dry cow ration costs out as a separate enterprise, or do you think it just is simpler to leave the dry cows in with the lactating herd economics?
Yeah, good question. Typically, we would have them separate, but then in terms of feed cost per hundredweight, we put them, we merge them together. So in other words, we try the best we can to track the dry cows separately, but then when we get to the feed cost per hundredweight total calculation, we would include the two of them. Yeah, the dry cows sometimes is a bit of a blind spot in that at a feed cost of 5 cents, 6 cents per pound of dry matter, if I may use that for far off dry cows, sometimes one dairy will have 25, 30 cents lower feed cost per day on their dry cows than the next guy. And everybody kind of missed it because we're so focused on the milk cows. Yet, if we said 20 cents different on milk cows, everybody would jump up and down, holy cow, that's a big deal, which it is. So there certainly can be reason to track the dry cows separate, but then ultimately we merge them together.
We have another question came in here. It says, kind of long, cost to raise replacements currently are worth more than the value of the heifers in some situations. Do you have any dairies increasing do not breed in older cows and really focus on heifer preg rates? Really, how many heifers can a dairy afford to raise?
So that's actually a powerful question in that there's a time element to it. And what I mean by that is, it's going to take 22, 23, 24 months to raise that heifer. So you're trying to make an economic decision based on forecasting the market 22, 23 months down the road. Another way of saying that is if you just had a blank piece of paper and you were making the best economic decision today, there's been times here this last year where you wouldn't raise any heifers. You would just say, well, I'll just buy them. But that does not do anything in terms of predicting the future markets, and it also doesn't put any value or cost to things like biosecurity, genetic merit of your own heifers versus purchase ones, a lot of other things that go into it. And so, I think many good dairymen will continue to raise their own heifers for some of those reasons, even though just running the straight dollars and cents, you could argue that you're right, as the question stated, it's costing more to raise them than to just go out and buy them.
Do you think, to follow up on that, if the herd is not increasing in size, should they breed the bottom third of their herd to beef or to get maybe a more valuable calf that goes into feedlots, or do you not enter into that discussion?
Well, if I understand the question right, longevity has some merit, no two ways about it. Both in terms of potential production on a second, third, fourth lactation versus first lactation, and maybe from something that's less quantifiable like animal welfare. But that all said, I think the industry has somewhat been put in the corner with the stigma that higher culling is always inferior or worse than lower culling. And financially, time and time again, when we look at the financial performance of a dairy, it's often the dairy that has a big pipeline of heifers that has a lot of discipline around their do not breed program and trading up animals. The people that have spent time on getting clarity within those decisions on a dairy are often the ones that have the best financial performance, and so they may have a higher cull rate, but yet trading cows out, if you will, financially is helping the dairy.
Another question on preg rates came in here. The heifer preg rate relative to the milk cow preg rate, is there any ratio that you look at to say they should be like ratio between the preg rate on heifers versus cows? We're looking at, you said numbers over 38, and yet maybe 24 is good for the herd. Any feeling on trying to tie those two numbers together?
Yeah, good question. I'm not sure I've ever...
excuse me for butting in here. I'm sorry. And you might want to comment on the use of sex semen, how those might affect our goals.
Okay. Yeah, as far as kind of a percentage or ratio, I must admit I've never really quite thought of it in that context. I'm going to think about that a little bit more. I think it probably goes somewhat hand in hand that a dairy that's got fairly high breeding performance within the milk cows is probably doing better with the heifers, but maybe not as high a correlation as one might think. At least that's what I've learned in my own travels, that somebody could be very, very focused on their milking herd, and that for various reasons not quite as much in their replacement. So I'm going to have to say that there probably isn't a real strong ratio. Now, the other part of the question is, could there be a correlation? And that's the part I can't answer. Apologize for that. I haven't given that enough thought. Relative to the sex semen that Steve was bringing up, and I don't know, maybe, Steve, can you just maybe elaborate a bit on your question?
Well, I just wonder if we have a goal, if we can do 38% on our heifers, would it be different if we were using sex semen in that case? For example?
Yeah, okay, thank you. So I think we all know that, the sex semen is probably going to have lower performance than a conventional semen, and so of course the rate at which the sex semen was used would impact that some. So yeah, that's a very good point, Steve. Particularly if you're going to benchmark it, there's a great example of why benchmarking across dairies can be dangerous. Within dairy, you benchmarking against yourself and being aware of decisions like how much sex semen did we use last year versus right now, very powerful. But across dairies, there's a great example of how benchmarking can be dangerous. So,
Jim and Mike, we are at the end of our appointed hour. We still have quite a few people online and maybe some other questions or comments, but at this point, before too many more have to leave us, I want to again thank you, Jim, for a great job today, and also Kuhn North America for their sponsorship of this webinar, and calling people's attention to our January and February webinars with Mike Hutjens on carbon footprint. That's going to be on January 9th and February 13th. Garrett Essel from the University of Wisconsin on ketosis. Also, for those of you that are joining or with us, you can view past webinars as well by going to hoards.com and looking in our webinar archives. They're available to you, and also there'll be a list of past webinars in our December issue. We invite you to look for that, and there'll be a guide of some of the webinars that you can go back to and pick up if you have the time. And Jim and Mike, let's go ahead if there are any other questions or comments.
Yeah, we have, I think, two more quick ones here. Jim Barmore, how do you adjust for the added cost when you pre-mix silages, which is a great concept? In other words, you face off, and what about the extra fuel for mixing, the labor, wear and tear? Do you put that into a cost, or have you ever thought that through?
Yeah, great. Another good question, because obviously there's some time to it, but it's really fairly minimal. It really is. Most of these operators would have fairly large bucket type equipment, and it really is very minimal time. There's not a lot of stirring. It's more of just pushing it across the pile, and the lifting and moving and dumping of the silage, is a fair amount of mixing in itself, and so there's just not a lot of time. So we have not. Obviously, there's some cost and time associated with it, but it is really quite minimal.
Two economic questions quickly. I know your time is valuable, Jim. The $1.60 labor costs that came up on one of your PowerPoints. The question is, is that the hired labor? Where does management? Do you put a management fee into that as well for the manager? There may be some unpaid family labor as well. What do you do with those scenarios to get that number of $1.60?
You know, great catch, because again, the benchmarking thing where you got to be careful. Some dairies won't have any owner-manager fee in there, or not fee, but labor costs, excuse me, payment to themselves as owners. Often it is included, and then once in a while you'll find a figure that's really quite high, which certainly is fair and appropriate being the owner, but then that also can skew your numbers if you're trying to benchmark it. I myself feel there needs, when you have an on-site owner that's involved in any type of day-to-day management, that needs to be included, and certainly it can be discussed and discounted if it's, you know, a figure that the appropriate group involved feels it's too high, but there needs to be some kind of owner-manager fee included, with the rationale being if that owner salary was not included, it's very likely that they would have had that time and effort would have had to have been replaced by some manager that would incur a labor cost. So again, I think it's not quite so much about benchmarking across dairies, but rather being very focused within dairy of what that figure is, and then being able to track that across time, and then also being real mindful of what's going in there, the forage harvesting, some of those other contract costs that can sometimes distort the true labor cost.
One last question I have on this end here, and that is the heifer cost. Primarily, you had like Idaho, Texas, the West Coast. What's your feeling in Wisconsin? That $1.60. Do you think that's going to be pretty typical, or do you think there's any regionalization in terms of that cost for heifer?
Yeah, there is, and it's going to be a fair bit higher in the Midwest and out in the Northeast, where we have more conventional barns, confinement housing. We have costs associated with some of these barns relative to some of these open lot type operations, and so it wouldn't be unusual for replacement costs in the Midwest to be $2, $2.25, some cases even higher, and it's mostly related to the housing component more than even the feed component.
Well, Jim Barmore, you've done yeoman's job. We sorry to run you over. Jim Bolts indicates where we have to pay you more money because we've overcharged you 7 minutes. But thanks very much. Our thanks to Jim Barmore for a very good seminar and his response to his questions here. Steve, we'll turn it back to you. Our best of holidays at this stage.
My thanks again also to you, Jim Barmore, and to Kuhn Knight, and great job. A lot of people joined us and stayed with us, and it showed the interest that you've generated. Again, Mike Hutjens will be our next webinar on January 9, sponsored by Merck on milk's carbon footprint, followed by an Elanco-sponsored webinar on February 13th with Garrett Etzel, University of Wisconsin, preventing and treating ketosis. Thanks again to all of you who have joined us today, and happy holidays.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.